everyone who's listening to us live on air. This is WURD AM 900. We're broadcasting live from Mitten Hall on the north side of City Hall on Broad Street on the campus of Temple University. This beautiful, stately building, this wonderful chandelier, resplendent in the midst of this room, makes us all feel welcome, and we're glad to be here. You are, of course, cordially invited. And this program, ladies and gentlemen, is sponsored, of course, and created by the Mann Center for the Performing Arts. It is a program that is dedicated to the premise of Let Freedom Ring, a scholarly panel discussion that centers in the life and the contribution of Octavius Cato. My name is Nick Taliaferro. I currently host the Evening Drive program at WURD AM 900. For all of you who are here in the room, and for all of this time you were confused thinking, that's Denzel up there. No, it's Nick Talley, that's all it is. So close. That's all that we have. We want to start our second session, and I must tell you that in talk radio, sometimes you spend a lot of time on the banal and the mundane and the insignificant. But that last discussion with those four gentlemen was the epitome of what good communication should be. Would you please help me by giving another warm round of applause to our previous panel. We want to thank them for their contribution. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are now going to shift our focus away from the mid-1800s when Octavius Cato lived and died, and while we will retain the figure himself, we move him forward into our current times to discuss his legacy and how it should impact, or does impact, the life that we are living today, the climate of our current environment. Let me introduce you to our panel. I will start at your extreme right and my left. First of all, we are grateful to have before us a local civil rights leader who is the author of 8 books and serves as senior pastor of the Liberation Fellowship Church of Jesus, and is also the president of the Greater Germantown Business Association. He is Dr. John E. Churchville. Our second panelist grew up on the West Coast, pastors on the East Coast, and went to school everywhere in the middle. He's a graduate of Clark Atlanta University and also Payne Seminary, and he currently pastors the historical Mother Bethel AME Church as its 52nd pastor. Please make welcome Dr. Mark Kelly Tyler. We are grateful to have, as Dr. Blockson said, don't forget the women, and we are grateful to have one rose amidst the other gentlemen, without getting myself into any trouble. She is a living compendium of civil rights and social rights here in the city of Philadelphia, and has distinguished herself as a local civil rights leader, and she brings the distinct perspective of a woman on these matters. Please, if you would, greet with me Karen Jordan. And I've been looking forward to this moment to introduce our final guest, who is the artistic director of this program, but I am thoroughly convinced that he was created by God to embarrass the rest of us pure mortals. This man does more in 1 hour than most of us get done in a week. He is a scholar, a theologian, a musician. He is an event coordinator. He is a vocalist. He is a composer. He holds the Benjamin Mays Fellow Award, and also he is a Jackson Scholar and the Mordecai Wyatt Johnson Fellowship Award, and an award for homiletics, which is the art and craft of preaching. When I grow up, I want to be Reverend Nolan Williams. Reverend, if you be so kind. Well, we want to get into our discussion now because we are bringing this figure into the 21st century now. And we're going to start, Dr. Churchill, with you. Although Octavius Cato was murdered well over a century ago, almost a century and a half now, for trying to do the most basic act of citizenship, which is voting. We just hear, as of yesterday, Judge Bernard McGinley saying that voter ID regulations cannot be enforced. We're still fighting the same battles. Can you give us a little perspective on the difference between the election and voting battles of Octavio V. Cato's time and our contemporary time, if there's any difference at all?
Okay, there is a slight difference. And the difference is that we have some abilities and some skills now that we didn't have then. And so what I want to do, if you'll let me do that in answering your question, what I want to say, then I'll answer your question. What we didn't really understand that Cato understood. And so what I want to talk about for about 2 seconds, it'll be less than 2 minutes. What I want to talk about is that there were 5 revolutionary graces that O.V. Cato had, that some of which has been passed down and some of which has been forgotten. But I want to remind us that these revolutionary graces are required for what we need to do today. And there were 5 graces, and to help me remember them, I called them, what did I call them? I called them free up, that's what I call them. First thing was that Octavius was a man of faith. He was a faith man. It is important for us to understand that no revolutionary activity can happen to bring African-American people to where they need to be without a strong, dynamic, absolutely revolutionary, non-quiescent, but self-liberative faith in God. The second thing is that he was a race man. He did not get confused about, oh, I'm just a human being. No, I'm a black human being, created in the image and likeness of God. When God first created Adam, he wanted somebody to look and show in physical form what he was in the spirit. So he made a black man. We need to understand that we can't get anything done unless we're race people. We called it race man back there. We call it Afrocentrist now. So we have to be Afrocentric. The third thing is, he was, as was pointed out by the last time, he was an education man. Ignorant people cannot rule. People who don't have an understanding of what's going on around them cannot lead and they cannot follow. And so education is paramount. Not just education to say, oh, I know Spanish, I know French, I know this, I know that. But a focused education that focuses on the liberation of our people. The next thing that he was, that we need now, and we need to push it very hard, is that he was an organized man. He was an organization man. And whether it was baseball, whether it was politics, whether it was a social club, he knew that his faith and his education and his race consciousness had to culminate in organization. And finally, he was a political man. All of that stuff is wonderful. Believing in God is great. But you know, faith without works is dead. And so we have to have a violent faith. I call it violent because we need positive violence. And I don't have time to talk about it, but by the way, when you get a chance, look at my this is my 9th one. This is my 10th one. This is the sequel to this.
I was going to tell you the whole
Towards singularity. And I talk about the quiescent self-liberative contradiction, which explains a lot of things. I don't have time to do it today, but get this book, you can get it anywhere, and get this book, which is the sequel, which talks about where we go from here. Okay, so he was a political man, he understood that. So what we need today is a remembrance of who we are. We are so embarrassed. We want to be, what do you call it, Renaissance people. We want to be everybody, instead of understanding that our power as black people comes from our understanding that and loving it and putting it out there big time.
Thank you, sir. I take note that on this panel I have 3 preachers, and whenever the preacher says I just need 2 minutes,
Watch out.
Understand, you got to watch out. Dr. Mark Kelly Tyler, we move in your direction now. One of the issues, and in the book, Tasting Freedom, it speaks about the use of police to enforce status quo to the extent that the police become criminal in trying to oppress certain groups of people. There are very distinct similarities between police abuse in the days of Octavius Cato, police abuse today. I know this might just be a launching point for you, but I want to direct that to you. What do we see now in our current law enforcement climate, stop and frisk, and so forth? Have we grown a lot from the misuse of police power from the days of Octavius Cato? And then from that point forward, you can take 2 minutes.
2 minutes and all. Like 6. Let me just say this, that I think that a part of the reason that we have so many issues with police brutality in our community, stop and frisk, and all the other things, is there's a lack of respect that is tied to the fact that as a people we're not organized, that we're not utilizing our resources in the way that we should. I never will forget that a white gentleman shot and killed an Asian student from some country, I believe Japan, Louisiana, during the Clinton years. I mean, the president almost went down, almost flew out to the other country to apologize, about this person with this random incident. And how many of our young men are killed repeatedly? You can't even get a call from the mayor. And part of that is because, again, we're not utilizing what we have, which is really what I wanted to talk about just a little bit. And I hope I don't go too far off of your question. This Donald Sterling, Los Angeles Clippers thing for me has just really reinforced a lot of things I've always thought. Now, this is the first time that I can ever remember where a group of unionized workers have forced a billionaire to leave his business. Not with a riot, not with bloodshed, not with the threat of violence, but wearing business suits, speaking very articulately, just walking in and just saying, we're not going to play. If he's here, we're not playing. And a billionaire, did y'all get that? Is having to give up his team, and his colleagues will certainly vote him out. There's no question about that. I mean, this is absolutely unprecedented. And the reason that happened is because the players understood the power of what they bring to the table. They make billionaires possible. And as a result, they get the kind of respect that is required when you make billionaires possible. Now, when Michael Jordan speaks up about something other than Hanes underwear or selling some product, you know that's something. Because Michael, Tiger, and Clarence Thomas haven't said 3 words in the last 20 years, all combined. And Michael Jordan comes out now and speaks about this because his feelings are hurt. Okay, I get that. But what would it look like if these same NBA players hooked up with NFL players and Major League Baseball players and said, we're not playing the game until you stop playing with voting rights? That we're not playing the game until you find a way to fund public education. That we're not playing the game, right? Until you actually make this a more just society, not just for some, but for all. And what is interesting is the intersection between Octavius Cato. I mean, Cato was not just simply concerned about rights as it relates to streetcars, but he wanted to integrate professional baseball because he understood how important sports could be to furthering the advancement of black people in America. And so here you have these billion-dollar athletes. Yeah, get pissed off about what Donald Sterling said. But there's a whole lot of other things that should get you angry and upset and want to use your collective power and what you bring to the table to make this world a better place for all of those young men and women who buy your jerseys, who watch your games, who celebrate your success. Don't just remember you're black when somebody white calls you a slave behind closed doors, but remember that you're black all of the time and that there are people who come behind us. The difference between Octavius Cato and the players I see today is that he did not have to go back for others. Isn't that right? Bill Murray and W.L.Blockson? He didn't have to do what he did. He could have taken his freedom and gone on about his business, but he lost his life trying to make the world a better place for others. And we don't see that same sacrifice in the folk with us that we have today. So I would simply say that if anything that we learn about this legacy, it is that civil rights is not one and done, but civil rights is something that we have to continue to revisit. In Cato's days, it was streetcars. In our day, today, it is schools that are closing. It's a prison industrial complex that is hell-bent on putting all black and brown boys behind bars as opposed to putting them in universities like Temple University. So we got to pick up the mantle and do our part. It's good stuff.
Well, but I want to ask you something that would be distinctly in your wheelhouse. I'm looking at numbers right now that say that even though women in general are starting to get closer to becoming breadwinners, that African American women make only 70 cents on every dollar paid, and sometimes only 64 cents, and certain times on every dollar paid. The people who make our laws, even though the country is half female, there are only something like 14 or 15 women in Congress. What do we have to do to bring the same kind of equality that Reverend Tyler spoke about? What do we have to do to make that also applicable to female and women's situations in our current society?
When I was reading about Cato, the other thing is I hear Cato. You've always said Cato.
I found if you just say it with authority, people think you're saying it the right way.
Okay. I don't know all the answers, but I know women have always had to fight for something. And we're always left out. Women had to fight to vote. That never changed. Nothing changed. From the time that we have been in any country, women have always been looked down on. And it takes all of us to do something about it. We can all vote now. We know what candidates we should be voting for. And whether you get out in the street and you have a picket line, whether you talk to that person next door, it's always going to be a fight, and we can do it. You don't have to wait for somebody else to do it for you. We all have a voice. We're mothers. We want the best for our children. We want the best for our grandchildren, regardless of color. And I know now there are a lot of fights going on to get fair amounts of money for women for labor. But I tell you this, racism is still here, and as quiet as it's kept, I call it I said replicates like DNA and RNA. It changes. So we can have laws on the books, but individually, people can still keep you down by saying they don't want you. They don't have to prove anything. We all have to keep that in mind, and we spoke the other day in front of a group of children. I know I'm going off, but listen to your children. You know them. Children can read faces. They can read the tone of your voice. Listen to them when they're saying, this person doesn't like me. They're giving me a bad mark. They're saying I'm not good enough based on the way they're being treated. And I say, listen to them. It doesn't stop because they're children. I work every day. I'm trying to figure out whether I'm going to retire or not. But I know there are things that I'm well qualified for. When the time comes, if they don't want you, they'll just say, no, we have enough people on the committee. But you know in your heart you're just as good as anybody else. So in spite of all of the laws, you're going to still have individuals, you're going to still have institutions that discriminate, and they'll say it's something else.
I've been waiting to ask this question, knowing that I have three ministers on the panel, but knowing that it comes to you. The place of the church in fighting for civil rights is indisputable. Everybody knows that. But back in the days of Octavius Cato and the days of Martin Luther King, the church would sing songs like "We Shall Overcome," and it spoke more collectively. And nowadays, the church has gotten a little bit more existential about what I'm going to get and whether or not I'm going to get my blessing and things like that. If Octavius Cato were to come back right now, as a man who has conducted liturgies all around the country, Nolan, I know you would be able to address this. If he were to come back right now and watch the church world, particularly the Black church, what do you think he would say? Or what do you think he would want to have done?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have an expression in my circle that, you can be so heavenly minded that you're no earthly good. And we have to be careful in the church.
Say that again, Reverend.
We can be so heavenly minded that we are no earthly good. And the preachers on the panel, and many of you, I see you shaking your heads, and those who are listening, I'm sure, understand that, worship is great, and I believe in the power of worship. I believe in the power of the church. I am a believer. But there's a point in which we have to balance the euphoria of worship and the experience of worship as a community confined within the walls of whatever that institution is, which are very often very pristine walls with carpeted floors, just beautiful sanctuaries. We have to combine the sanctity and the ethnocentrism even of the worship experience with a sense of connection with the community around us. We have to be engaged with the community and the world around us. And we have to use what is taking place in the sanctuary as power and fuel to then go forth from the sanctuary to actually make a difference. And really what we're talking about here, even as I believe in the power of ethnocentrism even within the African American race. It's great to speak of empowering ourselves and some of the things that have been shared, but we have to also recognize the importance of building coalitions. And really that's the power of even what's happening in this room today. And this is the power of what has helped to make whatever strides that have taken place in history. It's always been because persons, as Dr. Blockson was referring to, we call them sympathizers, non-blacks. They got it. They're people who get it, and they help to, whether they were Quakers that raised money or gave money to help establish schools, or whether they were persons who were working along with Frederick Douglass to fight the cause of the abolitionist movement. It's really about finding folk who are like-minded. Because sometimes we also think that everyone who's of the same color is really working with us, and that's not always the case. Sometimes we have to look beyond ourselves and find the greater good in terms of how we bring people together and work towards a common good. And that's the beauty even of what we're seeking to do with this festival and with this discussion today. And so those are just a few comments. I'm sure a number of the ministers will want to add to that.
I wanted to ask you, just taking off from that question about working together, and sometimes those who may look like you are not in support of you. One of the things that surprised me, I'd heard about it, but never in such detail, in the book Tasting Freedom, it spoke of the fact that in Charlotte, in South Carolina, that there were many African Americans or black people and some mulattoes who owned slaves just like the whites did. And one of the reasons why William Cato may have gotten out of it was to find a place with a little bit more equanimity. Dr. Churchville, black people owning slaves, exploiting their own people, is there any similarity to anything that might be going on today?
It is what it is because it was what it was. This is why I must recommend your reading. I break it down so. Now this is a scholar. You're gonna have to use your brain to read this book. I mean, I deal with some. No, really. No joking aside.
What's the name of that?
This is called Toward Singularity. The quiescent self-liberative contradiction as the African response to European global domination.
I'm going to buy it because it has the word quiescence in it. That just inspired me right there.
Part of the difficult, and by the way, the quiescent self-liberative contradiction is a reformulation of the Du Boisian double consciousness. And double consciousness is the schizophrenia that most African Americans have. We're schizophrenic because we're raised in a racist society, and so part of us wants to be black, and the other part of us thinks like we're white. And so we're so caught up in Eurocentric ideas. Most of the ideas that we get, most of the stuff we're told to read, most of the higher education, most of the stuff that we get, at least at the level when I was going to school, most of the stuff we got was Eurocentric, and that was the standard. And so there was a feeling of guilt. So I think that the wonderful job that African scholars have done, both African and African American scholars have done, is just absolutely tremendous. I make a point in my book of mostly referencing African American scholars to make the points that I want to make. The point I'm making is that there is this confusion. We have among us, there's some of us who are integrationists and some of us who are nationalists. And the issue for me to think of the thing that I'm most concerned about is developing my folks. We have contradictions. We have external contradictions coming in. We have internal contradictions. We got all kinds of phobias and stuff that happen person to person. And we got stuff that's coming down on us in society. And it's important to me to put my whole focus on African Americans. I have, I'm not anti-white, I mean, yes, once upon a time I was a black Muslim. Once upon a time I was a Quaker. I experienced racism as a Quaker. So I've done a lot of things. I mean, I've been a lot of places theologically. And the thing that God has put in my heart is to work with my own people. I'm like a Moses in a sense. Moses didn't spend time trying to organize Canaanites. That wasn't his role. He just wanted to get his crazy people together. If you read Jewish history, Jews are like black folks. They're crazy as hell. And it takes all their effort to just kind of keep them in line. I mean, historically, I'm saying this because we're crazy people. And people who've been persecuted are nuts. They really are. All of us who have ever experienced any kind of oppression are just nuts. And we're brilliant and we're crazy at the same time. So we use that to express ourselves intellectually, musically, artistically, and to understand that it is important for me and for my house and my family and my people to concentrate on getting well. And people who want to be friends can be friends. I'm never going to tell anybody don't be my friend, but I ain't looking for no friends. I got to love my enemies. This guy next to me is my enemy.
Say that again.
I got to learn to love my enemies. This guy's my enemy, she's my enemy, he's my enemy. I'm my worst enemy. And by loving my enemies, I get to love myself. I get to love this guy and this beautiful woman right here. Baby, don't get mad with me. And this guy down here. And so that there's so much stuff going on within our people that I have been called to just work with my folks.
Well, I want to thank you for filling up my email inbox for me tomorrow. I assure you that I'll be answering some questions. The previous comments were not so I don't know. You certainly can, and then I'll come to Dr. Mark.
I think about the civil rights movement in the 60s. I was a teenager at the time here in Philadelphia. And I went from, I'm going to join the civil rights movement. And then it was black and white together. And then from there I went to hate white folks. And I'm at the point now, people are people. Because you're my color, that doesn't mean you're my kind. And because you're white, doesn't mean you're racist and you're against me. So a lot of us that have grown up around that time, we've all changed. We've all gotten older. I mean, getting arrested back in the day, I wouldn't think about it now. I have no responsibility. When you look at the civil rights movement or any movement, it was always the young people that really got out there. We were the agitators. You from like maybe 12 up to 30. And you look at the people in our history, they were young people. Now we had the old kids. They were the ones that were telling us a lot of things to do and what not to do. They were the ones that had our backs. Cecil Moore, I'm a member of the Cecil Moore for Freedom Fighters, and we worked to keep his legacy alive in the city of Philadelphia. He did a lot of things. And talking about the mummers, when they stopped blackface, when they got the injunction, because Cecil said, if you come down here past South Street with that blackface, we're going to cut it to red. That's how you got that injunction. It was a lot of things. Don't think we didn't fight for equal opportunities with the bus companies. That didn't change from when O.V. Cato was there. We're still fighting those kind of things. Equal education, we're still fighting for that. We're still fighting for parity in the schools. That hasn't changed. The fight continues. The human rights issues and the civil rights issues of today are housing, health, employment, no discrimination, no sexual biases to people in their workplaces. I don't think anything's changed. It's just that the struggle continues and it replicates like the DNA. There's another fight somewhere else, but it's all the same thing.
Dr. Mark Kelly, I come back, you're right in the middle of this, literally and figuratively. The president of the Los Angeles chapter of the NAACP says that, look, we know that what Donald Sterling said was bad, but we're willing to forgive him. And for the cause of unity. Some people are saying, well, too much unity dilutes our power. Other people are saying, well, you know, we're all human and we have to learn to get along. What part does forgiveness play, integration play, when it comes to trying to make strides, distinctly and particularly for the African American community in the face of oppression and discrimination?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, it's clear that we're in a very diverse country. And so coalition building is always going to be important. And, but the bigger concern is that your base is together. You can't go coalescing with anybody if you're not together yourself. Dr. Churchville was just talking about. So I think that that's absolutely critical. You know, I was happy to see the fact that it was not just black NBA players that were going to walk off. You know, their white colleagues were going to walk off as well. And that's absolutely important. But again, the bigger issue is whether or not we're together. You know, I mean, you look around our city today, and you know, you can't pick up the newspaper without finding, you know, petty squabbles among, you know, leaders in the black community, right? You know, our civil rights organizations are fighting not inwardly, but outwardly. You know, churches are picketing against themselves. I mean, you know, you can't, so we can't even get to the big things because we're mired in the small things. You know, going back to, you know, we can kind of, if I was going to stick with our subject here, Cato, and I just call him Cato because I understand that's what his family, that's the name, that's how they identify themselves. I used to say Cato as well, but you know, Cato, you know, he didn't live in the past, right? I mean, this guy was, for the first part of his life, his whole fight is dedicated toward eradicating slavery. Then slavery ends. Well, you know, then the fight for slavery turns into the Civil War, so then he uses all of his energy and effort to get, you know, black soldiers to fight. And then when it ends, he then quickly pivots to Reconstruction. So now what do we do that we've gotten our freedom? Now you got to do something. So, you know, he believed, Nick, in something I just heard a guy use about talking about change. He said, God is not the God of I was. God is the God of I am, right? That, you know, I am, so that it always changes. And that what I don't think we've been able to do in our generation is pivot to what the new challenge is. So we're still talking about the civil rights that was, right? So it's still waiting for the next Martin Luther King, the next Rosa Parks, the next, you know, Ralph Abernathy, the next Cecil B. Moore even to come along and to do for us what we have to do for ourselves. We're in a new day, and this is a new era. And so to your question about whether or not we need to be in partnership with other folk outside our community, absolutely. Because, you know, it is that kind of world. Barack Obama was not elected by 30 million black folk alone, right? That took a large coalition. But beyond the big coalition, the bigger concern for me is when will Philadelphia and black folk in Philadelphia begin to reflect what black folk are doing in places like Atlanta? You know, it doesn't do us any good to have a black mayor, black chief of this, black chief of that, black superintendent of schools, black everything in key positions if that does not translate into real gains for our people. Right?
You know, you may mention, you brought in the sports arena, and that is one place where typically racism and injustice found itself crashing against people of diverse backgrounds working together. I turn now to Reverend Nolan Williams about the art community. We're here under the auspices of the Mann Center, and art is typically an arena where your skills and your talent allow you to work with other people. What part does art have to play in bringing us together and leading us forward as we seek justice in our community?
Yeah, that's a great question. When you think about the power of music and art, it has the power to overcome all obstacles. You know, you put persons in the same room from different countries of the world, whether they speak the same language or not. Persons can be blind or able to see. They can have physical abilities that vary from being fully operative to being paralyzed. But it's something about art that is the great unifier. My friend Norman Lear has an expression, and many of you will recognize that name, television producer from 70s and 80s, but he has an expression that I really have taken to heart, because he believes that if our world is going to be redeemed, it is going to be through music and the arts. And think about that for a minute, you know, that there's a certain point at which there's a certain plateau to which words cannot ascend. And there's a certain plateau to which even all of the picketing and all the rioting in the world cannot ascend. There's a certain plateau to which laws and legislation cannot really ascend. And yet music and art can go to that place, or take us to that place, where at least, if only for 5 minutes, we're all together. If only for 5 minutes while the song is playing, we're all feeling and connecting, and maybe letting go of some of our prejudices, letting go of some of our anger, and in that moment we're all one. We're a community united. Doesn't mean the problems go away, but it certainly helps us to, be reminded of what is possible. And as long as we have that glimpse and that experience of what's possible, hopefully it inspires us all the more to keep striving towards the possible. And that's really why I do what I do. You know, you were half jokingly talking about me and my bio, but you know, at some point I've been very blessed, and I'm a trained musician, but at some point, with all the opportunities that I have had, I made a personal commitment that I wanted to spend the rest of my life using my gifts to impact community and to leverage the power of music and the arts in order to make a difference. Because I believe that music and arts have that intrinsic kind of power to really deal with a lot of these issues that we're talking about. And it's really great to see the Mann and then all of the partners that have come on board that get this and recognize the opportunity that we have to bring the community together, as we have done today and as we're doing through the course of this festival and in festivals that are to come.
For those of you who are just tuning in, this is a live broadcast emanating from Mitten Hall on the campus of Temple University under the auspices of our friends at the Mann Center for the Performing Arts that centers in the personality of Octavius B. Cato. It's entitled Let Freedom Ring, and we're about to now ask our second panel, and we're going to ask you if you would give us just a summary statement as to what you think Octavius Cato would be doing or be about now. We'll ask you each to take a minute or so, and then we will ask our first panel to join us. We will receive your questions and direct them to our super panel so that you might be able to have responses to the inquiries that you put on your 3x5 cards. We'll start with you, Dr. Churchville, and we'll go forward, Dr. Churchville, Dr. Mark Kelly Tyler, Ms. Jordan, and then Reverend Williams. Just in a minute or so, give us a summary of what you think Octavius B. Cato would be doing now, or telling us we should be doing that.
Okay. He'd be telling us, first of all, get Churchville's book. Toward Singularity.
Really,
Get
Doc?
that book.
Really, Doc?
And for those of you who want to know where to go from here, because you understand this, get the second book, Challenging the Black Hole Theory. You know, an African-American roadmap for the journey from here to eternity. Seriously, I don't have a clue what he'd be doing, because people are created for the times in which they live. They are men and women for their season, and they do what they do, and when they're not here, it is for us to carry on. So I can't really honestly answer what he would be doing, other than telling people
He
to buy
would do
these
that.
tools.
Absolutely.
But I can say this, what we ought to be doing is to seriously look at and examine what are the problems with the way race relations have been handled is we haven't spent enough time.
In just a minute, sir. We only have a minute left.
Oh yeah, I've got 30 more seconds.
You do?
All right. We haven't spent enough time really seriously getting into our sickness, our quiescent self-liberative, our double consciousness. That has to be resolved. We have to move to one place. We've got to decide who we are, what we're going to be. We can't keep halting between two opinions.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Tile?
Yeah, I kind of envision Cato in the same light as Jim Brown, former player with the Cleveland Browns, in the sense of using his celebrity. I have no doubt that if he were alive today, he would have been a tremendous professional baseball player, probably a Hall of Famer. And using that celebrity and using his influence to really take on whatever those issues are today. And I mean, we don't have to, begin to think real hard on what those issues are. We just kind of drive through our neighborhoods today and see the great disparity that exists. I think he would really just devote himself to addressing not the old Jim Crow, but the new Jim Crow. And so how do we end that prison industrial complex that's locking our kids up? How do we address, finding funding in Pennsylvania to make sure that children don't have to sit in schools without nurses or without counselors or share desks and share books. In the 21st century, our schools today look like they did in Cato today. Two kids sitting on a desk sharing one book in a public school in Philadelphia is absolutely outrageous. My children attend Philadelphia public schools, and I tell you, it's a throwback. So I think that's where he would be. That he would really be using what God has blessed him with to try to make the world a better place for others. From everything I can read about him.
Ms. Karen Jordan.
I would like to think that Mr. Cato, I would like to see him be a mentor to the young people coming up. Through his whole life, he realized what he was doing, he knew what he was doing, and he made mistakes. And I'd like to see him be a mentor to the young people that are coming up now, to let them know which way to go, and how to manipulate it, how to utilize all of their assets to make a difference. Because we have to teach our young people. That doesn't stop. It never stopped. And we're talking about education, we're talking about equal rights. It's not going to stop. And I think I would just, like I said, I'd love to see him be a mentor to the children, like you see some of us old civil rights people trying to mentor the young people, to keep them on the right path, and to keep them in our hearts, and to keep them motivated, and to keep them motivated to learn and to excel in anything that they do. This is what I think.
And finally, Reverend Williams.
That's a great question. I think Cato, like many of the other great iconic figures in our history, were they to come back, I think they would have, to use a modern day vernacular, the SMH moment. They would shake their heads as they looked around and saw the advancements and then the regressions and kind of wonder what happened. I think the expectation would be that we would be further along than where we are. And then, true to form, they wouldn't stay in that moment, nor would they allow us to stew in that moment. They would roll up their sleeves and then get busy challenging us to challenge the status quo and fight the great fight all over again.
Ladies and gentlemen, our second panel, we want to thank them. Would you join me in join round of applause? And we will ask now for our first panel to join us at the table. We have enough microphones, and I do believe we have enough seats. For those who have written questions and would like to have those questions brought forward at this time, we still have a few moments left, and we will receive your questions. Unfortunately, we can't vet them, so we're kind of just left to Providence to figure out which questions will come first. Hopefully you may have directed them toward an individual. If not, we'll direct it toward our panel. and we are certain of one thing, that you will get an answer. It may not be the one that you want, it may not be the one that you had hoped for, but you will be getting an answer from a panel such as this. I thank you all for writing in a manner that is legible. I know that many of you know different languages and hieroglyphics, and I thank you for refraining from using any of those. Oh, this is excellent. All of the questions that I can read. And now that they have been seated, I will not take the time to introduce them again, because time is of the essence. We will simply go into reading our questions to our panel. I noticed that they're not directed toward any individuals in particular, but we'll just get started with one. Question number one is, was Octavius Cato active in protesting against disenfranchisement strategies in the South during the 1870s Reconstruction? And that's an excellent answer. I mean, why don't we start, Dr. Blockson? Of course, we are right at your house, so we give honor to you by asking that you might respond to that first. Shall I read that again, or?
You said the 1870s?
In the 1870s. Was he?
He was assassinated in the 1870s, 1871.
Yeah, it did say during the 18th, because that was just 1 year. Right. I'll tell you what, why don't we do this? Was he active in protesting against disenfranchisement strategies in the 1840s?
Yes, even as a young man he was, along with another friend of his, I forgot to mention her name, who worked side by side with him, Mary Ann Shadd Carey, who was in Rosa Parks of her day. She refused to give her a seat up. And she went on to be part of the Underground Railroad and became one of the first attorneys. So they worked hand in hand. But they would be appalled today, I think, if they came through formerly Columbia Avenue, down Sesame War Avenue, down to South Suite, West Philly, to ponder why did we let other people come in and chase us away from our territory. You walk down these streets that I used to be familiar with from Barstow, coming to the city, South Street was ours, Columbia Avenue was ours. Temple, look what's happening to the temple right here. It's changing. What's happened to our people? What happened to the cemetery? Why don't we honor our cemetery? There's a cemetery with 3,000 African Americans covered over. We don't honor our dead, so they would be appalled today.
Dr. Mark Kelly Tyler, did you want to add anything to that last statement about cemeteries and honoring our dead with the work that you're doing at Mother Bethel and the Wekico project?
Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Blockson. And I would just add that the lack of respect for our dead is not something that's new, right? So that even the Bethel Burial Ground, which maybe what you're referencing, had fallen into disrepair during Cato's lifetime. So it's not, I mean, I would have to imagine that he probably attended burials at that burial ground when it was still active, but that burial ground was rented out. No one seemed to care in that era. You know, there are a couple of newspaper articles where people kind of raised concern. But the fact of the matter is, even when our church sold it in 1889, there was, you can't find any article about an outrage about the fact that these bodies were left there and that it was turned into a park, that there was not even a sign or any kind of thing placed to give recognition of the fact that there were 3,000 to 5,000 very important Black persons who had been buried there. So I think that speaks more to a larger issue with us as a people, with kind of the way that we choose to have selective memory when we look back at the things we choose to care for and things we choose to neglect. And our burial ground is not something that is by itself. This is something that's a bigger problem that is really across the country, wherever you find these same types of places.
Thank you, sir. A second question comes in, and I will direct this to the authors of our book, Tasting Freedom, Mr. Dubin and Mr. Dubin and Little. Thank you. Don't get my age, folks, you forget things. What event would you say, quote, radicalized, unquote, Octavius V. Cato? And last but not least, does he still have living descendants in the Philadelphia area? Was there a catalyzing event that you can think of, John?
I will answer the second question first. There are Cato descendants in the South, in South Carolina and in Virginia that Dan and I know about. There may be more. and in North Jersey, that's right. But I'm not aware of any in Philadelphia. By the way, we know it's pronounced Cato because the family members told us they were taught as children to pronounce it as cat's toe, cat toe. As for a radicalizing event, no one's ever asked us that before, and I think he grew up in a church in Philadelphia where his father had the speakers of the day, the Frederick Douglasses, the Henry Highland Garnetts, etc., there all the time, and I think he heard those men speak. He heard those men cry out against the injustices that black people were facing in the 1840s and 50s. And I think that was the world he saw and the world he was trying to remedy.
I'll just add this. It's a really good question. You know, he was a novel figure in a lot of ways because, as we talked about, in the face of all this racism and denial of fundamental rights to an education, to serve in the army, to ride in a streetcar, his father managed to get him to a very good education. So he comes up to adulthood. We actually saw this in a lot of the writings and the words of Cato and the young men and women around him. By the late 1850s, somewhat like the 1950s and 60s, they had it in their heads that they could change the world. They were not going to settle for the situation as it was. This thing of being armed with an education gave them this sense that they could undo the way things were, and maybe a realization that it was not going to be easy was when Cato tried to take 90 or 100 students from the school and sign them up for the Union Army in June of 1863, and was turned away by state officials, and knew right then that every step he took was going to be a battle. I mean, right after that, you see him launch himself in the streetcar movement, launch himself into the Equal Rights League, which was not only in Pennsylvania, but a national effort, sort of a forerunner to the NAACP. And if there's a radicalizing moment, maybe that's what it might have been.
There's another question here, and it actually resonates with what we have in our hands. And they say, why is it that we only see one photo or one engraving of Octavius V. Cato? I'm pretty sure that people weren't taking selfies back in the 1800s, but is there another photograph, either Reverend Nolan or Dr. Blockson or our archivist, Mr. Bingham? Is there another likeness of Octavius Cato that we are aware of?
I think there's one more. I've seen one more, additional one.
Do you happen to have it in your collection?
Excuse me, my voice is going. Cheney had it for years, so I don't know what happened to it. I saw it years ago when Cheney used to come use.
Well, fortunately for us, we know who to ask. Mr. Bingham, what did you do with that other likeness?
Well, I have to confess, by the time I got there, I couldn't find that photo. Unfortunately, you know, there's some things that were missing from the archives because our archives went for a long time without libraries before I got there. I do know that there is a lithograph ink likeness of Cato that appeared in some magazine that used to do yeah, Harper's Weekly.
Okay.
Very good likeness in that one. But I will go back and sometimes think, you know, when things get lost in the archives or misplaced, sometimes it may be years before they show up. So I'm going to look for that. Now that Charles has told me there's another one there, I'm going to look for that.
Thank you. Well, whoever asked that question, we just sent Mr. Bingham on a mission. That's a good one. We'll come back to this place next year at the same time to see if we can locate it. Question comes forward. Octavius Cato attended First African Presbyterian Church, later the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas, where he served 5 terms on St. Thomas's vestry. The church's lay governing body. Now, what role did faith play in Cato's life, and what role did the churches of that era play in the struggle for justice? I'm sure where to go. We've got several ministers, we have historians, and we have journalists who chronicle the light. I'll just toss this one up in the air, and the first one taps is Vincent.
Well, you have, so you actually have the archivist at St. Thomas sitting right there, Art Sutherland, so he's probably better qualified than all of us to speak to really his faith.
Oh, okay, well, you've been called upon, sir.
Well, I guess.
Why don't you come forward and use my microphone, and I'm going to go ahead.
Art is a great archivist, by the way.
Thank you, Dr. Tyler. I would just say that probably one of the most important examples was in our archives, we can show that every year that we document him being a member of the congregation, he paid his pew rent, which today obviously would be your tithing. So he put his money where his mouth was in terms of supporting the congregation, and he paid it in full by the end of each year, obviously not in 1871. And I truly believe that it was his membership on the vestry, working with a lot of the older members of the congregation, like James Needham, like Scipio Sewell, who helped form him. So indeed, he was mentored, and I do believe he would be a mentor today if he was here. And so I think they mentored him in his faith. They mentored him along with his father, who was an AME minister before he became the pastor of First Avenue Presbyterian, in his political activities as well. And so they certainly form an example for all of us of what the church and other organized bodies can do today.
We must not forget that he was the son of a preacher. So every Sunday, you knew where Octavius Cato was. He was in church. So
Absolutely.
I think his faith was very, very important.
But, you know, I just want to add that not just any church. You know, I mean, St. Thomas had a particular message. You know, that's Absalom Jones's church. He and Richard Allen were together and always had a leaning towards social justice. And they, you know, they had that those Charleston roots, again, where people were very much politicized. I want to throw a book out there by Bernard Powers. It's called Black Charlestonians. Because you mentioned, Nick, about the fact that blacks owned other blacks as slaves, but in Charleston, many of the blacks who owned slaves did it because it was the only way you could free somebody. Because it became illegally, even whites were not even allowed to free their slaves. Not through their wills, they couldn't free them. So blacks would buy their spouses who had earned their freedom to hold them in quote unquote slavery. So I want to qualify that so listeners not out there thinking that, you know, that this was kind of a rampant thing, but in most cases, that's what it was. Although there were some who really did just buy slaves because that's what they wanted to do, and there were no pure motives. But Black Charlestonians is a great read.
It's a good book. I'm looking forward to giving my hands on that one myself. The question comes to us regarding the murder of Octavius Cato, which occurred at, I do believe, the tender age of 32. Am I correct in that, gentlemen? At the age of 32, at the hand of one Frank Kelly. Can one of our biographers or one of our historians assist us in reframing the murder of Mr. Cato?
Funny, Murray and I always try to not give that part away when we're talking to an audience about the book so as to leave some suspense. But we kind of came to the conclusions that there were two forces really on a collision course by the afternoon of October 10th, 1871. There was this rising, genuine black political force that mattered a lot to who was going to be elected. And it was a big Philadelphia city election that day. And back then, unlike now, people turned out in great numbers to vote. That great question earlier about what Cato might do today, I think he might be astonished at how many people do not trouble themselves to exercise the things that he gave his life for. But on that day, October 10th, 1871, Democrats who were in control of part of city government here at that time were in fear of losing power, and as Dr. Blockson said, losing jobs to a rising Republican tide that had a lot of newly enfranchised black men in it. And one of the leading organizers, if not the leading organizer of that turnout on that day in October, was Octavius Cato. The guy that's widely believed, I think it's safe to say, did kill him, a young Irishman named Frank Kelly, was an operative of and a bartender for the Democratic organization in those days in South Philadelphia, led by this great evil character, William McMullen. And Frank Kelly, as you'll read in the opening page of our book, had a number tattooed on his hand, number 27. That was the number of the fire company that was kind of William McMullen's paramilitary force. And along with white cops who answered to McMullen, that group of people set out pretty much under orders to suppress the black votes that day, to kind of kill off this political force in its cradle. And there were scenes that day of white thugs and white police officers in uniform pulling black men out of the voting lines and beating them or arresting them or dragging them to court. There's a great scene in the courtroom that day. I mean, now we have election courts, and the issue is, you know, did you get stopped because of the voter ID law? Did you get stopped because you weren't on the rolls? That day, men were brought into court who were bleeding from the beatings that had been applied to them by Philadelphia police. And it's at the end of that day that Kelly confronts Cato outside his house and shoots him to death. And he shoots him in the back, chases him around a horse-drawn streetcar. And we were able to look at records and determine that the car that Cato ran around trying to save himself was an integrated streetcar with blacks and whites riding in it, thanks to the efforts of Cato and people around him.
Let me, and just in asking, my understanding is that Frank Kelly was never convicted of that murder?
Yes, he was. He basically fled the scene with what we believe was the help of Philadelphia police, and is gone from Philadelphia for 7 years. And no one is convicted. And then finally, 7 years later, he's brought back. A trial takes place, and he is found not guilty.
Last witness for the defense, William McMullen.
For those who didn't hear, he was found not guilty, and the last victim for the defense was William McMullen, the man who put him on the path of the assassination.
And basically, all of the violence of Election Day and Election Eve, which saw scores of men hurt, and I think 4 people killed, no one was ever convicted of anything involving those 2 days of election violence.
That's sobering, and it's the kind of thing that makes you, well, I guess if you're dignified, you don't get mad, you just have holy smoke and it's righteous indignation, but it really gets to you. I'll direct this next question. For those of you who want to read more about it, the book actually does a beautiful job laying out the scenario of October the 10th, 1871. It is something worth laying your eyes upon. This question takes us now to the side of Octavius Cato that we haven't spoken about a whole lot today, but that needs to be mentioned. And that is, do you believe that Cato would be a great baseball player today who would still be committed to activism if he were living in this present time, given the impact of hyper-commodification and today's extremely problematic, I think it says, misuse of the multi-million-dollar salaries, all of which were non-existent and non-influential during his era. And this person, I will be giving you your PhD directly after for that question. What do you think, Mr. Bingham? Would he be a baseball player and an activist?
Oh, I think he certainly would. He loved baseball. He's also a great cricket player. But his baseball team was no just run-of-the-mill club. He had 4 teams of 9. So he had enough players that they could play 2 games, one on this side of town, the other on the other side of town if he wanted to. And they took on all comers. He played, not only was he a player, but he was also the coach and the general manager. He set up the games. He was an excellent athlete. So I think that, it's very possible that if he were here today, that he might be playing in the major leagues.
Yeah, I mean, we are at the point where we have to wrap up our program. It's been an extraordinary opportunity to hear from a plethora of great minds, but how did this man squeeze all of this into 32 short years? And how do we, Reverend Nolan, I offer this to you, how how do we glean from his life so that we can lend it to our children? Today, we need to recognize that greatness can come early.
Yeah, it's really a matter of making each moment count and not taking any day for granted. And I think a lot of times we think that we have years ahead of us. We think that we've got time to finish our projects. We think procrastination is our friend. And I think his work ethic is just a great example of how you don't need a lot of years to accomplish a lifetime worth of goals. And that when you really are focused and you're really dedicated to what you do, you can do a whole lot with the very little that you're given. And for me, the preacher in me sees the parallel between Cato and Jesus Christ. 32 years and 33 years. And it only took Christ 33 years to really change the world. And you could say something similar about Cato. 32 years to really have a profound impact, such that here we are 150 years later, speaking of his legacy, and reading of his legacy, and learning of his legacy, and learning from his legacy. So, carpe diem. To all those who are here and those who listen, seize the day.